Last month I made a video asking if Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag by leaving the UFC. It's probably one of my most divisive videos to date, as it elicited virtually every response that could be voiced on the topic. And future beige here, I have to interrupt my own video because my plan for the painting for this video was actually to take the painting I did for my UFC 270 review, which was in black and white, and colorize it while also improving the painting with the skills I've acquired since last year. Unfortunately, the screen recording for the first 20 minutes of that painting just wasn't usable due to some issue with OBS. So I can't show you how I took it from black and white to color. But I can show you the before and everything afterwards, where I actually did the painting and the refining and all of that stuff. I just wanted to mention this so there was no confusion as to why there's the black and white painting I did last year and then it hard cuts to like the painting in the video. So either way, let's get back to your regularly scheduled programming. Since I released that video, the circumstances surrounding Francis have only become far more interesting. He has officially scored what is almost certainly the most lucrative free agent contract ever by signing with PFL, a move that may end up going down as one of the most influential decisions a single fighter has ever made in MMA history. So I decided to revisit the subject and give you even more of my opinions. But before I get into that, I do have one small request. If you like this video, please leave a like or a comment. And if you like my content in general, I would appreciate if you subscribe. It will really help me out in the algorithm. If you want to support the channel financially, you can become a Patreon member. You don't have to, but it would just help me out a bit and I would really appreciate it. With that out of the way, let's get to the main point of this video. In the last month, a lot has happened. Personally, I believe that there is an overarching story that goes beyond just the question of whether he fumbled the bag or not, such as the rapid intensification of backlash from fans in the days leading up to the announcement of the PFL signing. Then how eventually the tide of public opinion turned, with Francis now being lauded by many as a game changer who bet on himself and won. To tell the story, we have to pick up basically where we left off. Shortly after I released my last video about Francis, we received some big news regarding ONE FC, as ONE CEO Chatri Sityodtong revealed through text messages to the South China Morning Post. ONE FC had withdrawn from the negotiation process with Francis Ngannou. This came shortly after Chatri announced that he would be meeting Francis to discuss their final offer for him. According to Chatri, he met with Francis for nearly 3 hours, and the promotion decided to withdraw from the process of bidding for Francis Ngannou's services. Quote, "After careful reflection, we decided not to submit our final offer. Francis is a good guy and a good champion. I wish him continued success and happiness. At the end of the day, I didn't feel Francis and I were fully aligned on non-financial matters. It is nothing personal. It's just a lack of alignment." End quote. After we learned of ONE FC withdrawing their offer to Ngannou, Ariel Helwani reached out to Francis for his side of the story. According to Ariel, Francis said that he was already close to signing a deal with another promotion, but decided to hear Chatri out because their meeting was already on the books. In the interest of transparency, Francis let Chatri know that he had already verbally agreed to the deal with another promotion. Ariel went on to speculate that this was Chatri's attempt to get ahead of the story for PR purposes.
I think he did the old PR move where you get ahead of it and you tell your side of the story and you make it seem like you're walking away, as opposed to, maybe you couldn't come to terms because he had a deal or he wanted something else, etc., etc.
Obviously, this speculation from Ariel was based off information he got from Francis. However, knowing what we know about Chatri's tenuous relationship with the truth, I am inclined to believe that this was an attempt to save face by the promotion. In an interesting turn of events, Jake Paul actually came to Ngannou's defense, saying that it's funny how promoters always try to devalue fighters for their own benefit/narrative. This might not actually be all that surprising, as Jake was working with PFL, who was the likeliest candidate to sign Ngannou at the time. In the second draft of this script, I've had to rewrite it a few times. I was going to make some points speculating as to what issues they weren't aligned on, but that was before we got part 2 of this drama with Chatri and ONE FC. On May 2nd, Chatri spoke to the Daily Star and claimed that Francis turned down a $20 million guaranteed contract because he wanted non-financial terms like having a seat on the board of directors for ONE, as well as being able to determine his opponent's pay. However, after Chatri came out and made his comments about Francis wanting $20 million and the ability to control his opponent's purses, Ariel spoke on the MMA Hour and claimed that what Francis was asking for was the guarantee that his opponents wouldn't be underpaid.
He wants his opponent to make at least a minimum. He wants a guarantee that his opponent cannot be underpaid, in other words.
Even before we knew what we know now about this situation, there were problems with Chatri's claims. The first, as I alluded to a few moments ago, is that Chaudhry is not very trustworthy. In general, you should never give a promoter the benefit of doubt on anything they say, but especially when they're talking about a fighter. Francis isn't the first person a promoter has lied about, not by a long shot, and he won't be the last either. Promoters are incentivized to bend the truth, if not break it. If there is nothing else I can impress upon you during this video, it's that you have absolutely no reason to believe anything a promoter says, unless you can independently verify it. With that in mind, Chaudhry in particular is known for this kind of behavior. Up until very recently, he was considered to be the biggest bullshitter in MMA. You can look up any number of claims he's made about one, from their rehydration policy, to their viewership, to their financials, and they don't really hold water. Just go watch his most recent interview with Ariel Helwani and count the number of dubious claims he makes. Another issue is that $20 million figure. I find it funny that Chaudhry only came up with that number after David Feldman spoke to Ariel and said that Francis was asking for something in the $20 million range to fight for BKFC.
I'm in a position that if I make a wrong move on 20 million, my company's over.
Sure, of
Right?
course, no.
To me, this just seems like Chaudhry impulsively throwing out that $20 million figure because he didn't want to look like one couldn't afford Francis or had less money than another promotion. What I find interesting about this story is how it highlights the way some MMA fans are willing to set aside the actual evidence we have in favor of inventing their own interpretation of events, especially when it comes to Francis Ngannou. You had Chaudhry saying it wasn't about money. We had a quote from Francis by way of Ariel Helwani that he had all but come to an agreement with another promotion. Yet people concocted their own storylines out of whole cloth. Even when another quote from Chaudhry came out saying they were willing to pay him $20 million, people made up their own stories. There seemed to be a desire to celebrate Ngannou's downfall before it had even happened. People weren't looking at the situation objectively, or logically, because they wanted Francis to fail. They were acting almost like they could will it into existence, or at the very least, if they repeated their narrative enough, it would become the accepted truth. But allow me to pose a question to you. Why? What did Francis do to provoke this backlash? To generate this much ire? First of all, let's look at the legitimate questions and concerns regarding the way Francis handled his exit from the UFC and what was going on behind the scenes. Where was his manager? What was his plan? These were valid questions at the time, for which the answers were scant, if not non-existent. We got some vague comments about Francis that he wanted to sign with an MMA promotion and then have a boxing match in the summer. He was linked to multiple boxers, but we also kept hearing rumors about Deontay Wilder potentially fighting Anthony Joshua, and Tyson Fury had also become extremely hard to pin down with his prospective opponents changing on a daily basis. They still are. Additionally, we had two promoters publicly claim that they had exited negotiations with Francis, BKFC and ONE FC. That didn't look good on paper. As we would later learn from Francis, it seems unlikely that they were actually the ones to pull out of the negotiations. That said, this brings me to the area where Francis did drop the ball. He did not do a good job of controlling the narrative. When Francis discussed Chaudhry's comments on a recent interview with Helwani, he said he believed that Chaudhry was just being a performer, but also said that Chaudhry's dishonesty made him doubt other aspects of his life story.
Before this drama, I'm like, oh, I like this guy. I like his story. Now I have in doubt. I've even questioned if that story is true, but I used to love that story.
Francis also opened up about the supposed meeting he had with Chaudhry, confirming what he privately said to Ariel about already having a verbal agreement with PFL at the time and speaking to Chaudhry out of respect. However, he added some additional details. The way Francis describes the situation makes it seem like Sijitong was badgering him for a meeting, offering to fly Francis out to Singapore or fly himself to Cameroon, which Francis didn't really understand because he had already explained that PFL had agreed to everything he was asking for, and more. Eventually, Francis agreed to meet Chaudhry in LA. Francis' side of the story is that he had just gotten off an 11-hour flight and was waiting to catch another flight. He was under the impression that he would just chat for an hour or so, but it sounds more like Chaudhry held Francis hostage for 3 hours while Ngannou was chugging coffee and checking his watch so he didn't miss his flight. Apparently, during this lengthy conversation, Chaudhry was showing Francis screenshots of ONE FC's massive viewership numbers, including the billions of viewers in Asia.
I think he showed me like 13 screenshots, all the statistic, how ONE FC is the second more viewed sport in the sport. He has more view on YouTube than Premier League, than NFL, than NBA. I'm like, damn, whoa.
Which is the most Chaudhry behavior I can think of. But probably the funniest revelation was that Chaudhry offered to make him the Nelson Mandela of MMA.
show me on ONE FC are going to explode, are going to be like Nelson Mandela.
I think you might want to brush up on your understanding of that story, Chaudhry, because there's a really significant part in the middle that you might have missed while reading the Wikipedia page. Similarly, Francis said that neither he nor anyone from his team had ever spoken to BKFC founder David Feldman, and that Feldman was probably just making things up because he had a card to promote.
Because I never spoke to him. My team never spoke to him. And then when I saw his comment, I'm like, where is this guy coming from?
It's a bit unclear why Francis didn't publicly address any of these comments in the moment. I think it's a given that he has more scruples than the promoters he's dealing with, but he also seems to like to keep his cards close to his chest for one reason or another. He was careful not to burn any bridges with the UFC as well. Perhaps Francis just doesn't care about the people preemptively celebrating his downfall, because he knew that he had already worked out his deal with PFL. Maybe his silence was actually a brilliant marketing plan, because it kept people talking and kept his name out there in the public consciousness while he was finalizing the deal. In any event, the optics were not great. We weren't getting Francis' side of the story, and that made it easier for fans to be swayed by the narrative that Francis had fumbled the bag. In my opinion, these were valid criticisms to make about the way Francis was handling the deal, at least with the information we had available to us when this was going down in real time. If you were raising these kinds of concerns in good faith, I don't think you were turning on Francis or being a hater. There was nothing wrong with making reasonable criticisms or questioning the wisdom of Ngannou's plan, but there were hordes of people who weren't, and still aren't, operating in good faith. In every place that fans were discussing the story, you had people making up the wildest shit. You can pick a number with as many zeros as you like, and you would see somebody saying that Francis was asking for it, with no evidence to back it up whatsoever. Even when a promoter claimed to have offered Francis $20 million, the goalpost was moved to something else, like saying he's trying to get his opponents paid less. I could go on and on about all of the random bullshit people pulled out of their ass to convince themselves that Francis was the bad guy, or that he didn't have loyalty to the UFC. If you actually believe shit like that, I think you're either profoundly naive or you have some kind of agenda. All you have to do is look at what happens to every UFC legend towards the end of their career to see what loyalty does for you. After a decade of putting their bodies on the butcher's block for the company, the best most fighters can hope for is to have their remains fed into the meat grinder of young up-and-comers. That way every ounce of value can be rendered from the carcass of their career. Then maybe they can go fight in BKFC or box Jake Paul, which is the closest most MMA fighters will get to a retirement plan. But I digress. Let's circle back to the question I posed earlier. Why did fans turn on Francis like this? To start, I think it's important to note that MMA is a sport filled with haters. It seemed to offend folks when I used that term in my last video, but come on, if you've been an MMA fan for any length of time, you know what I'm talking about. Go visit any noteworthy fighter's social media page and there will be some douchebag replying to their tweets with GIFs or images of said fighter being knocked out or submitted, the lowest points in their life. Even the nicest, most innocuous guys like Robert Whittaker have people who hate them. Francis has always had some haters. I think some of it stems from the UFC promoting him so hard prior to the Stipe fight. Ironically, what people forgot about that situation is the UFC was pushing Francis because they were trying to throw Stipe under the bus, or more accurately, the Ford Escort.
Francis Ngannou has the world record for the most powerful punch. His punch is the equivalent to 96 horsepower, which is equal to getting hit by a Ford Escort going as fast as it can. And it's more powerful than a 12-pound sledgehammer swung full force from overhead. Holy shit.
But he ended up getting clobbered, and we got the famous comments from Dana about Ngannou having a big ego. Ever since that fight, a certain group of people have hated Ngannou, and they grasp at every scrap of hearsay that paints him in a negative light. But it's not a problem unique to Francis. What is unique to Francis is the way so many people have turned on him after he became a free agent, especially given what we know to be objectively true. I think there are several factors at play. First is simply sour grapes from the Jon Jones fight not happening. A lot of people who were prematurely celebrating Ngannou's downfall probably didn't hate him to begin with. However, Francis did something that very rarely happens in MMA. He denied us a fight. Of course, fights fall apart due to injuries, scheduling conflicts, or the UFC simply not wanting to make that fight happen. Think Nate Diaz versus Dustin Poirier last year. Rarely, almost never, does a fight of this magnitude fall apart because a fighter puts their foot down on some issue, because they never have the leverage to do so. Francis inadvertently denied us the Jones fight, which pissed a lot of people off. It also allowed them to be swayed by the UFC's narrative that Francis was afraid to fight Jon, even though Jon was the one who avoided fighting Francis multiple times. It's wild how quickly everyone forgot Jon's own feud with the UFC. Jon was the one saying that 10 million wasn't enough to fight Francis. Remember Show Me the Money? Do you remember at the UFC 260 press conference when Dana said Jon should be moving to middleweight instead of thinking about fighting Francis Ngannou?
Super fight.
If I'm Jon Jones and I'm home watching this fight, I start moving to 85.
Because I do. Jon actually got praise for knowing his worth back then. The same thing people were trashing Francis for trying to do recently. And don't get it twisted, Jon wasn't asking for too much money. The UFC could have paid him $20 million for that fight. They have the cash to do it. They just don't want to set a precedent like that. Nonetheless, you can see people reaching for those grapes whenever Francis comes up. Even if they don't realize it, they're subconsciously revealing their true feelings, that their desire to see Jones versus Ngannou should take precedent over what Francis wanted. That being said, I think this is just a symptom of a larger issue that people don't like talking about. If you've been a fan of this sport for a while, you will have seen a carousel of terrible human beings get a pass from MMA fans because they're fighters, not role models. I'll grant that there is some truth to that. I agree with the idea that if you can't make a living fighting in a cage, what options are there left for you? But it's just interesting to compare the way MMA fans at large will give a pass to something like domestic violence, but as soon as a fighter brings up fighter pay, or health insurance, or sponsorships, or the fact that they aren't really independent contractors, or anything else that reflects negatively on the sport, MMA fans will start doing mental gymnastics like you've never seen in your life. I think the reason for this is actually pretty simple. MMA is a young sport. We're not that far removed from the dark ages when MMA was borderline illegal. It's taken a substantial amount of effort to get rid of that stigma and change public opinion. If you're an MMA fan, you've probably had to defend the sport to somebody who still confuses it with pro wrestling or thinks it's human cockfighting, which is probably why the reaction to Power Slap was so universally negative. MMA fans were united like we rarely ever are on this one issue, because we all saw it as something that could set MMA back by proxy. This need to defend the sport has created a sort of toxic relationship, where a lot of MMA fans view the sport as an extension of their own selves. Therefore, any critique of MMA is taken as an attack on the MMA fan as a person. I believe that is why when people bring up issues like fighter pay that make the sport look bad, they are attacked like almost no one else. At some level, MMA fans know that fighters are underpaid for what they put their bodies through, but you'll see people twist their minds into pretzels trying to excuse or defend fighters being underpaid. From delusions about fighters secretly being taken care of with huge locker room bonuses, to the truly moronic arguments people make about fighters actually being overpaid because they only have to work for 15 to 25 minutes. I think a lot of fans do this though. They have to create these excuses because to acknowledge the realities of the sport, from injuries and CTE to the inequities of fighter pay, is to introduce a moral conundrum into this thing that you deeply love. How do you square the circle of enjoying something that is so inherently exploitative? A significant portion of MMA fans, probably even the majority, simply don't want to deal with it. Until someone like Francis comes along and makes it almost impossible to ignore. I think that is why in the aftermath of his departure from the UFC, we've seen so many people turn on him. He took a stand against a machine far bigger and more powerful than himself, and in the process shined a light on a lot of the darker aspects of the sport. People don't like that. It makes them uncomfortable because it disrupts their fantasy world where there are no real consequences for the people fistfighting in a cage for their entertainment. That is what was really at the heart of so many people turning on him. It's also why so many fans completely ignore when he repeatedly says that money was not the driving issue behind all of this. It's much easier to ignore the evidence and withdraw into a comfortable fantasy than it is to acknowledge the unpleasant truth. I think that is why the tone of Francis's critics changed once we got the rumors of the PFL deal. People committed to a take that Francis was making a huge mistake by leaving the UFC, and they didn't want to be wrong. So again, the goalpost shifted, which was the beauty in saying that Francis fumbled the bag to begin with, because you never actually had to explain what that meant. The people saying Francis fumbled the bag couldn't articulate how or why, because it hadn't happened yet, but they were convinced that he had. Then Francis made all of the detractors look like fucking morons. In the early morning hours of May 16th, the New York Times broke the story of Francis signing with the PFL. This was accompanied by a press release from the promotion as well as a video from Francis discussing the news himself.
Yes, Francis Ngannou again. I want to thank you all for your support, for being patient since I became a free agent since December. Working on a great deal. takes time. I want to announce you that I'm officially partnering up with the PFL for the next step of my career, which is going to be tremendous. It's going to be huge.
The exact details of Francis's contract haven't been 100% released by Ngannou or PFL, but multiple sources with knowledge of the negotiations confirmed several points to John S. Nash of BloodyElbow.com. According to Nash, some of the more noteworthy details of the deal were that it is only for 2 or 3 fights, it guarantees a high 7-figure purse for each fight, a split of the event's net profit, a signing bonus or salary serving as a brand ambassador for PFL, the right to have his own sponsors in the cage, non-exclusivity with regards to boxing, no champions clause or other extensions, and a minimum purse amount for his opponents that we would later learn is as high as $2 million. The deal will also make Francis the chairman and minority equity owner of PFL's Africa branch when the company starts to move into that continent, something PFL has been planning to do for a few years now. Additionally, PFL's press release revealed that Francis would have a leadership role by becoming PFL's first active fighter member of their global advisory board. Last month, when I made my video asking if Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag, I really wasn't sure how this would go. The boxing super fights were always a really sketchy option to rest your hopes on, but the MMA side of the negotiations seemed uncertain as well. I personally thought that Francis getting below 7 figures and the option to box would have been a win for him, but it was not clear if a deal like that would ultimately be possible. In reality, Francis got everything he asked for. I think the gravity of the situation is going over a lot of people's heads right now, but this is unprecedented. The reason so many people doubted him was because it was unthinkable before Francis went and did it. There are a lot of things you can say about this contract, and plenty of people have already broken down the details better than I can, so I'm not going to go over them all. But there are a few that really stand out to me as crucially important. First, the guarantee that his opponents will be paid at least $1 to $2 million. If you listen to what Francis said during the interview with Helwani, he says the reason he wanted his opponents to have a guaranteed purse amount is he thinks it would be unfair for somebody to work their way up the ranks to fight a guy like him and only make pennies to his millions.
Yes, let's make sure that the guy that I'm fighting is going to have his own money. He's going to have a proper training camp. He's going to afford a good training partner. He's going to afford anything that he needs to be at that level, you know.
More importantly is a seat on the Fighter Advisory Board. If you remember, this was one of 3 requests Francis put forward during his last round of negotiations with the UFC. But it wasn't even something he had to ask for during negotiations with PFL. They already had a fighter advisory board featuring several retired fighters like Randy Couture.
Along with the PFL, now that I'm in the position to speak, to fight for those who doesn't have a voice, because at the end of the day, it's fighter first. Fighter is the one doing the sport.
I don't think you can necessarily call this selfless or altruistic, as it definitely benefits Francis as well, but it shows a level of concern for the welfare of other fighters that you virtually never see in MMA. MMA is an individualistic sport, and promoters frequently use the crabs in a bucket mentality to prevent fighters from working together or organizing. Just think of how many times you've seen a fighter like Jorge Masvidal bring up fighter unions, only to drop that noise the moment they get a bone thrown their way. This mentality was specifically something Francis mentioned being frustrated by in the past. That there are hundreds of fighters working for the UFC, and yet they have virtually no leverage due to the fact that they are individuals being pitted against one another. Francis is one of the only fighters actively working in the interest of his peers. In my opinion, this shatters the argument that Francis was being greedy or asking for too much, because a huge part of what he was asking for was intended for other people. I think the realization that Francis was telling the truth all along has finally started to sink in, as we've seen the tide of public opinion turn once again. The announcement of the PFL deal has been met with overwhelming praise for Francis actually managing to get his impossible deal done. Daniel Cormier, who was saying not too long ago that Francis should bite the bullet and return to the UFC, was now praising Francis as a game changer in free agency. And Chael Sonnen, who has made approximately 700 videos in the past month saying that Francis fumbled the bag, is now trying to take credit for Francis signing with PFL. But not everyone is so willing to change their mind. There are still people holding on to the idea that Francis fumbled the bag, and they are hitting the copium harder than ever. The argument used to be that Francis was fumbling the bag because he was asking for too much money, or he overvalued himself, or he didn't know how to negotiate a deal. But now that he's going to make as much money, if not more than the UFC offered him, and he's getting all of the other terms that he wanted, the argument has changed to, Francis chose money over legacy. He's going to be fighting tomato cans in PFL. He ran away from Jon Jones, etc. Since Francis announced his deal with PFL, we've heard similar opinions echoed by Jon Jones, as well as the head goof himself. After the announcement, Jones took to Twitter to whine about Francis calling himself the baddest man on the planet from across the street, adding that Francis wasn't calling himself the baddest when he was a free agent, only after he was safely in a new organization. Which is factually untrue. More to the point, it's funny for Jon to bring this up when he waited until Francis was safely a free agent before moving up to heavyweight, something he had been talking about for over 10 years. Francis simply responded by challenging Jon to cross the street. A few days later, Jon interrupted an interview that his teammate Maurice Green was doing with MMA Mania to call Francis a pussy with a lot of muscles.
Francis is a pussy and always gonna be a pussy. With all that muscle.
Now, I'm not going to call Jon Jones dishonest, hypocritical, or morally bankrupt. I think his legacy speaks for itself. But I will point out that earlier this year, Jon was the one praising Francis for his decision to test out free agency. Quote, "I'm happy for Francis. I'm glad that Francis knows his worth. No man has a right to shame another man for fighting for his worth. I was in a very similar situation as Francis as a light heavyweight. I was never happy with my salary. I had to sit out 3 years and I missed a lot of time. But now we're here. I encourage Francis on his journey, and I wish him all the best. Another company is going to be truly blessed to have him." End quote. No man has a right to shame another man for fighting for his worth. Words to live by, unless you're Jon Jones, of course, in which you can abandon them as soon as it becomes convenient for you. As for Dana White, his position on Francis has not changed much since earlier this year when he announced that Ngannou had become a free agent. During the post-fight press conference for UFC Fight Night 223, Dana was asked what he thought of Francis signing with PFL, and he reiterated his previous opinion that Francis didn't want to take any risks.
Francis wants to take 0 risks. Doesn't want to take any chances.
As well as the idea that Ngannou knew he would lose to Jones.
And he obviously didn't want to take a chance against Jon Jones. And after we saw what happened with Ciryl Gane, I don't blame him. I think the outcome would have been exactly the same. And I'm sure most of you do, and I'm sure Francis does too.
I don't think it's necessary to relitigate the issue of Francis not wanting to fight Jon, because literally all of the evidence we have points to Jon being the one who avoided that fight at every opportunity. But the idea that Francis doesn't want to take risks is ridiculous if you know his life story. It's ridiculous when you realize that he gambled on fighting Ciryl Gane with one good knee on the last fight of his contract, or that he risked everything to become a free agent and try to box the best heavyweight boxer in the world. It's beyond ridiculous, actually. It's preposterous. Dana went on to say that Francis fought 3 times in 3 years, and they don't do that here.
He's fought 3 times in the last 3 years. It's just not what we do here.
That's why Jon went 3 years without having a single fight and was given a title shot up a weight class, of course. Then there's Conor McGregor, who hasn't fought since July of 2021, and was allowed to exit the USADA testing pool to take that shit that makes your fucking head grow. The list goes on and on. Also, Dana saying that he doesn't put on gimmick fights was pretty funny. They made the BMF title twice. They gave CM Punk 2 fights in the UFC. They let James Toney fight Randy Couture. He just said the other day that if Tyson Fury wanted to fight Jon Jones in MMA, he'd make that fight. That's not even mentioning Power Slap, which is promoted on all of the UFC's social media pages and by Dana himself personally. I dare you to go to the UFC's YouTube page and count how many fucking Power Slap videos there are compared to MMA videos, because by the time I get this video out, I can almost promise that there will be new ones. But hey, they don't do gimmick fights here. Okay. Francis responded to Dana with an uncharacteristic Twitter tirade, and I'm just going to read you the whole thing. Quote, "What is your problem with me? 1. I completed my contract, was a free agent, and choose to walk away. You didn't release me. 2. I hate taking risks. That's why I defended my title to fulfill my contract with no ACL or MCL. 3. The reason I fought 3 times in 3 years is because you wanted to control my deal and sign a new one, and freeze me out. I owe these guys 3 fights a year. Isn't that what you say? What happened? I always asked for and never said no to any fight in the 3 years. I'm finally getting paid and respected and have a deal that's fair and equal for all parties. Why are you so against me being free and happy?" End quote. I think this was the perfect response to Dana's nonsense, so I don't have anything to add to it, other than that it's entertaining to see Francis finally go off like this. I'm sure that as the weeks go by, we will see more comments from all parties involved. I'm sure that new stories will continue to be published, adding more insight into the negotiations between Francis and PFL, and so on and so forth. But this video is already pretty long, and I have to finish it eventually. When I worked in the previous versions of this video, before it was announced that Francis had signed a massive deal with PFL, I was of the opinion that it would probably take us a few years to truly know the outcome of this decision. I still believe that. It is true that Francis achieved the unthinkable. He had already done something unprecedented when he managed to sit out his UFC contract as the reigning heavyweight champ. When Francis went into free agency, it was hard to believe that he would actually get everything he wanted from another promotion. Somehow, against all odds, he did though. This is likely the most significant free agent moment in MMA history, and it will probably make an impact on the sport, for better or worse. We've already seen the UFC add further restrictions to their contracts, like waivers against antitrust lawsuits, as well as lengthening the duration of their sunset clauses. So, the effects of Francis's decision are already being felt in some ways, though the broader ramifications of a deal like this are probably anyone's guess at the moment. The UFC is obviously the biggest MMA promotion out there. They have the overwhelming majority of the top talent in the sport. They make most of the money, and their brand is synonymous with MMA to most people. It would take a lot to truly change the game. With that in mind, it's important to note the significance of the PFL guaranteeing Ngannou's opponents a $2 million purse. As Luke Thomas and even Francis himself have said, this is also a recruiting tool for the PFL.
A lot of people being like, wow, Francis is a good guy. He might be, but that's a recruitment tool. It's, we've got Francis, and if you fight him over here, you're probably going to make a lot more money than you would.
$2 million is more than most fighters will see in their entire careers. Every heavyweight in MMA has to be looking at that $2 million purse and wondering how they can get that back. I would bet you that there are UFC heavyweights with 1 or 2 fights left in their contract, and they're already thinking about trying to sign with PFL. The Francis sweepstakes has the potential to be disruptive for at least one division. Also, while it may be a bit far-fetched to suggest that this deal could lead to the introduction of something like the Ali Act in MMA, I don't think it's completely out of the question. The situation is a perfect case study for anyone trying to make the argument that UFC contracts are too restrictive. How the rumor of PFL potentially buying Bellator fits into all of this is another piece of the puzzle that we haven't figured out yet. If they can raise the money and combine the two rosters, it does possibly present an interesting competitor for the UFC. But I will say that Dana made a reasonable point about some of PFL's more questionable business practices in this regard.
So you're an organization that's burning cash, have no ratings and selling no tickets, and you're going to raise $280 million to buy a company that's burning cash, sells no tickets, and does no ratings. It sounds fucking absolutely genius to me.
I would be lying if I said I wasn't a little concerned about PFL's future. We've seen similar stories play out in the past. Look at Elite XC or Affliction. Organizations are able to raise tremendous amounts of money, which they use to sign big-name fighters and set far-reaching goals. The result has always been the same. As such, there is a legitimate question of how long PFL can sustain this kind of spending and expansion before there is a collapse. We could end up looking back on this as either a catastrophic decision that killed PFL or one of the most influential decisions in the history of MMA. Or it could be both. It could be anything in between those extremes. We are probably still several years out from knowing for certain, and any number of variables could change the ultimate outcome. For Francis, the effects of this deal are more clear, although there is still some uncertainty. Let's start with boxing, because it was at the heart of the situation from the beginning. Francis has talked about wanting to box in the summer, but there is no opponent lined up yet. The Tyson-Fury fight seems more plausible than it did in the past because Fury seemingly can't pin down an opponent right now. At the same time, there is nothing concrete linking him to Francis either. Could the hypothetical one fight in boxing, one fight in MMA deal with Deontay Wilder still be an option? Maybe. Anthony Joshua in a soccer stadium in the UK? It's anyone's guess. Francis has also mentioned the possibility of having some kind of boxing tune-up fight. Realistically, what could that mean? A boxing match with another MMA fighter? Maybe a fight with an aging heavyweight boxer? Ngannou versus Shaq in some kind of bizarre celebrity boxing match? Again, I don't know, and we probably won't have any clue until something is actually announced. Additionally, we know Francis isn't going to have an MMA fight until 2024, when PFL launches their super fight division. So if the boxing match doesn't materialize, that means Francis will likely be out of action for over 2 years. His salary as a PFL brand ambassador and chairman will probably ease the pain a little bit, but it would still be a long time to go without a fight. Those are monetary concerns, though. As Francis has said repeatedly, the deal was always about more than money. Simply getting this deal done was a massive win. The freedom it granted him means that the opportunities for his career are essentially endless. Once his contract with PFL is up, he can go to any promotion he likes, including the UFC. Despite what Dana White says, the UFC would love to have him back in the promotion, because having your champ walk out and fight for another promotion is not a good look. They tried to paper over this by making Jones the heavyweight champ, but the fact of the matter is that the real UFC heavyweight champ is no longer with the promotion. They would like to get that back and keep it that way. Taking all of this into consideration, there is something even more important about this deal, which is why I've saved it for last. That is PFL Africa.
The reason why I signed with the PFL is because of they are willing to develop the sport. Most importantly, in Africa, I stand for my people, for my community, I fight for them, and to get something like this to bring back home is like a huge accomplishment.
Francis has stated that PFL Africa was the part of the deal that made him the most excited.
I mean, this is the big, for me, this is the big part of this contract, the PFL Africa type, because that get me excited more than anything else.
And he was happy about the decision. And the first thing he brought up to me was PFL Africa.
It should be fairly easy to understand why. If the PFL Africa branch succeeds, it will cement Francis's legacy outside of the cage. He will become a transcendent figure, a cultural icon of combat sports for many people in Africa. By providing athletes in Africa the path to an MMA career that he did not have, he may actually change the sport forever. If you've watched this sport for long enough, you've seen how MMA taking root in a country can change the landscape of the sport. You need look no further than Dagestan. The Dagestanis are a small group of people from a remote and largely unheralded part of the globe, but their impact on the sport has been monumental. Now think of what could happen if you build up the infrastructure for MMA in a place as large as sub-Saharan Africa. Personally, I've always believed that Africa was the unexplored frontier of talent in MMA. It's no secret that when impoverished, struggling people are given a way out through sports, it produces some of the greatest athletes in history. Those conditions are a crucible where greatness is formed, and there aren't many parts of the world where people are experiencing the same level of hardship as in Africa. There are many more people like Francis Ngannou out there, who have dreams of doing something with their life beyond toiling it away in a brutal manual labor. There is that 14 to 15-year-old kid who saw Francis become champion and thought, maybe my dream isn't as impossible as everyone tells me. You give those kids the resources and infrastructure to train, and you're going to create absolute monsters. To get that opportunity, Francis had to cross a continent. He had to jump over razor wire fences and paddle across the fucking Mediterranean just to get the chance. You can tell that he wants to make that easier for the next generation. He wants to give them the resources to make their dreams achievable.
Milieu rural comme ça, il y a toujours ce fléau qui est le fléau du découragement et manque de confiance en soi-même. Alors le centre, la fondation est un peu basée, conçue dans le sens de motiver les enfants, les pousser d'abord à croire en eux-mêmes, parce que faut reconnaître que tous les enfants qui viennent ici, on n'attend pas forcément d'eux qui deviennent des sportifs de haut niveau demain. C'est juste une façon de les galvaniser. C'est un peu ça qu'on veut mettre dans l'esprit des enfants et aussi leur permettre d'être ambitieux. Une fois qu'un enfant a de l'ambition, une fois qu'un enfant a du rêve et croit en lui, je pense que le succès n'est qu'une question de temps.
This is something Francis has been working on for years in Cameroon, but having a promoter behind him could change everything. At this point, I've written and rewritten and rearranged this script so many times that when I read it through now, I have no idea if I'm actually making a coherent point anymore. There is one thing I'm fairly certain about, though. I don't think there is any way that you can classify this decision as a mistake for Francis. The PFL deal may go sideways, and Francis may not end up making all the money he thought he would. He may not get a high-profile boxing match either. Only time will tell. But Francis stood by his principles. He did the impossible yet again. He made a mark on the history of MMA that can never be erased. Maybe it will end up as a footnote on the monument to the UFC's success, but it will still be etched in stone, and no one can take that away from him. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing, and a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you. Jonas Namenson, Rusty Shackelford, Iron Shamrock, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Laziest Man on Mars, Skunk Ape, Random Candor, Fuzi Eunice, Dot Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, What Gets You Hard, Lover, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Zach Taylor, Firebrand, Quasi, Snepsts, I Said No Cops, Paulo Gomez, Alex, Kyle, and Neem.